When we crossed our own threshold that Sunday, my husband offered me only 4 quiet words. He looked at me and murmured, "Not now, after," then said nothing further at all. I stood there genuinely puzzled, unable to grasp what those small syllables were meant to carry. We had just returned from a service that stretched nearly 4 hours across the morning. My feet throbbed inside their black leather, swollen from sitting on a hard, backless bench. My spine ached, and my single wish was to lay our roast upon the table. Yet there in the kitchen entrance, his hand closed around my wrist, soft but utterly resolved. He repeated the word again, after, and only then revealed exactly what he intended. That morning taught me a lesson no minister had ever spoken from the front of worship. It lived in the gap between what the Ordnung recorded and what it left to men. Before I describe his demand, before my prayer cap even left my head, let me introduce myself. My name is Mary Yoder, and I was raised Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Now I give voice to the stories we were trained from childhood to quietly swallow. This is Mary the Plain Truth, the place where a long silence finally learns to speak. If you crave honesty about plain living from someone who breathed it, please subscribe and like. And tell me below, who truly decided what unfolded behind the closed doors of your childhood? I read every comment that arrives, so now allow me to unpack what that Sunday revealed. To understand it fully, you must first see how Sunday actually functioned within my community. For us, it was never the lazy rest day the English so often picture in their minds. It stood as the most rigidly ordered day across the entire span of the week. Worship happened every second Sunday, traveling in turn from one farmhouse kitchen to the next. We owned no church building, only benches carried between homes in a single dedicated wagon. We rose before 4 to milk and feed, since the animals ignore the Lord's calendar. Then we dressed in our darkest, plainest clothing and drove the buggy in complete silence. The service itself unrolled across 3 or 4 hours on those punishing, backless wooden benches. The men gathered on one side, while the women settled together upon the other. No instruments ever sounded, only the slow, drawn hymns drifting up from the ancient Ausbund. Each line stretched so far you could lose track of where the singing first began. And the preaching, above everything, circled endlessly around yielding, around submission, around bending your stubborn self. Gelassenheit was the word for it, the surrender and emptying of your own private will. The bishop taught that a wife yields to her husband as he yields to God. Every woman on that bench knew the sermon followed her home and never truly ended. That trailing sermon is the piece outsiders almost never manage to fully understand or even notice. The English assume our rules are simply the visible ones that anyone driving past can see. The plain dress, the buggy, the untrimmed beard, all the markers worn openly on the body. Yet beneath the written Ordnung flowed a second current of unspoken, inherited understandings. They passed quietly from man to man, granting a husband authority the rest of us never measured. Our Ordnung described the outside of a life with astonishing, almost obsessive precision and care. It fixed the width of a hat brim and the exact number of pleats permitted. It ruled whether a battery clock was allowed and which shoe color counted as vanity. It governed the entire visible world, down to the smallest fraction of an inch. But about the private interior of a marriage, it offered almost nothing aloud at all. What a husband might request of his wife, and when, remained unwritten and entirely unspoken. In our world, whatever the words never forbid quietly becomes permitted inside daily practice. The silence was not some empty, neutral space waiting innocently to be filled by anyone. The silence itself was the permission, handed down and never once examined in plain daylight. I came to see this truth only long after I had walked away from everything. A rule you cannot name is a rule you can never gather strength to fight. I married Eli when I was 19, after a courtship as brief as every other one. He was 23, steady and gentle with horses, exactly the man my father admired silently. We wed on a Thursday in November, once the harvest was gathered and safely stored. I moved into the small house his family had raised with him, board by board. Through that first year, our Sundays kept a rhythm I never paused to question once. Worship, the long, quiet drive home, and afterward, the one real meal of our week. Roast and potatoes filled the table, beside the pies I had baked the day before. No labor touched the Lord's Day, so everything was prepared with care the evening prior. That Sunday meal was sacred to me in a way I struggle even now to explain. It was the single portion of my week that belonged entirely to me to give. Preparing it felt like an offering, a small, quiet sermon I preached with my own hands. So when Eli stopped me in the doorway and said the roast could wait, I froze. Confusion arrived in me before anything else had the chance to take a clearer shape. A roast already waited in the oven, and I had stood since well before dawn. Here was my husband calmly announcing that his wish would come first, ahead of the meal. Before lunch, before rest, before I had even lifted the pins from my prayer cap, I stood there in my own kitchen, still wrapped in the cold November air outside. My coat carried the scent of wood smoke and horse and the long buggy ride home. Everything within me wanted to simply lay the table the way I always had before. Yet his hand stayed on my wrist, gentle, and his voice held a settled certainty. He was not unkind, not raising his tone, not anything I could easily name as wrong. He simply expected, with quiet assurance, that the order of our home was his to set. And I, barely a wife at all, had no words yet for the cold thing stirring. So I stood suspended in that doorway, the meal forgotten, waiting to learn what came next. What came next was a quiet sentence about the body, spoken plainly and without apology or hesitation. He told me the meal would wait because his own need that afternoon came before everything else. The lesson arrived right there with him, sharp and silent, a thing no sermon had named aloud. He believed with his whole heart that the order of our home was entirely his to set. The sermon about a wife yielding did not, in his clear mind, stop at the church door. It rode home with us inside the buggy and then settled quietly at our own kitchen table. My own sense of how a Sunday should unfold was to him a small vanity to surrender. Meal first and then body second, my quiet preference was just pride a good wife should abandon. He was not cruel about any of it, and that truly is what I most need understood. He genuinely believed he was leading a godly home in the only way he had ever witnessed. No father had ever once shown him another path that a marriage or a Sunday might take. He demanded only what he had been carefully taught that a husband was always allowed to demand. And I, barely past girlhood, believed something equally firm and equally unexamined deep inside my own chest. The small flare that wanted to say no, the part whispering, "but my one meal," felt sinful. I had been taught my whole life that this inner resistance was Hochmut, the very worst pride. A good wife never weighs her husband's wishes against her own. She simply yields and becomes holy. So I yielded, right there that afternoon, exactly the way a faithful woman had always been taught. And afterward, there came a small, cold feeling that I had no name or any language for. I told myself it was only my own stubborn pride, dying just the way it should die. There is a certain portion of this story I simply cannot tell you here on this platform. The algorithm carries its own limits, and I have learned exactly where every one of them falls. So I wrote the entire remainder down instead, slowly, without softening, and without one single careful cut. The book is titled The Ordnung They Never Wrote Down, fully 208 unflinching pages. The link sits waiting in the very first comment, where the part I could not say lives. Because it was never really about that single Sunday at all, or that one particular quiet demand. It was about a deeper truth I had not grasped until that moment in my own kitchen. Gelassenheit asked for the surrender of my own will, and the silence around it demanded almost everything. The written rules were never once the real cage that truly held me bound firmly in place. The visible Ordnung was only the part that everyone could plainly see and openly point straight toward. Because everyone could clearly see it, that rule could at least be discussed, debated, and slowly changed. But the unwritten understandings were never once set in plain words, so they could never be questioned. You simply cannot vote to change a rule that not a single soul will ever admit exists. I want to tell you about my friend Sarah, because this did not happen to me alone. Sarah married a full year before I did, and we grew close in the Amish women's way. That meant we labored side by side at frolics and quiltings, never once speaking the true thing. One afternoon, we were canning tomatoes together, our two hands stained red up to the very wrist. Steam fogged across the windows, and she said something so quietly that I very nearly missed it. She said her own husband kept his rules about Sundays too, and then explained nothing at all. She did not need to. She only held my eyes one beat too long across the pot. We never spoke of it again, yet a whole hidden language moved sideways between all us women. It always moved in half sentences, and glances held one full beat beyond what was strictly safe. We all knew, every single one of us, yet we owned no words that were ever permitted. And a thing that holds no words at all is finally a thing you can never fight. You simply cannot raise any formal complaint, you eventually discover, against a silence that admits to nothing. It took me long years and a great deal of help to finally name this thing clearly. The written rule, however harsh it was, at least stood somewhere you could reach and finally resist. A full members' meeting could vote upon it, amend it, and soften its edges across patient generations. The silence offered nothing to grasp, nothing to bring before anyone, and nothing at all to challenge. My therapist, years after I had left, offered one sentence I have carried every single day since. The most absolute authority, she said, is the kind that was never once put into plain words. There is simply nothing standing right there to argue with, no firm edge against which to push. And at once I thought of that kitchen doorway, of Eli quietly murmuring the single word after. There had been nothing whatever to argue with, because nothing at all had ever actually been spoken. I do not tell you any of this to paint Eli as some kind of wicked villain. He was simply a man raised deep inside the very same silence that had once raised me. The tragedy was never one cruel husband. It was a whole entire world that chose that silence. I finally left at 26, and the whole cost arrived all at once, as it always does. The shunning came, the Meidung, that slow and quiet closing of every door I had ever known. My letters to my own mother returned unopened, and my father soon stopped answering all my calls. Then no calls remained to take at all, only a long silence shaped precisely like deep grief. I lost the very people who would have raised my burning barn whole within a single day. That is the true price of leaving, and I will not pretend that it was ever small. Yet out in the English world, I found words I had never once been permitted to hold. The cold feeling at 19 was never my pride dying. It was a whole person speaking softly. Consent and autonomy meant that yielding becomes real only when a person stays truly free to refuse. The Amish world still gave me real gifts I will carry faithfully down into my own grave. A wounded faith that still stays real, a deep community, and hands that can build almost anything. But no scripture anywhere ever requires a woman to surrender her will at her own kitchen doorway. If you ever felt a small, cold no inside, and were taught the no itself was sin, I do see you clearly. You were never proud or faithless, only a whole and breathing person. The full unsoftened pages wait inside the Ordnung they never wrote down, linked in the first comment. So choose your freedoms wisely, for yielding only ever matters when refusal was truly yours to make.